Now, I am absolutely thrilled, Danny, to have you back in Tokyo. Danny needs no introduction, really, and you've got the detailed CV here in the handout in front of you. I'm not going to read it out there. But the great thing about Danny is that he's got a wonderfully deep understanding of what actually goes on in Asia-Pacific, and a warm heart and a strong affiliation to Japan. So he's the one guy who doesn't forget about Japan, right, in international discussions. Now, there's a lot going on in the world. There's an awful lot going on here in Asia. So without further ado, Danny, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Jesper. Thank you. It's thrilling to be back in Japan, in Tokyo, at iHouse, and kudos to you all, to James, Sawako, Tagako, Jesper, the whole team. I think you're closing in soon on 4 years, which is amazing, and I'm so impressed and grateful for the hard work and good work that you've done. I'm glad to see other friends as well. So I'm going to sketch out a few thoughts and then open the floor to have a deeper discussion of the issues that matter to each of you. But let me set the stage by talking a little bit about 2022. The first half of this year has been unbelievably turbulent, and we're now approaching the halfway mark. We had, at the outset, some difficult months, beginning with, or including the boycott of the Beijing Winter Olympics, the Putin-Xi Jinping summit, Friendship Without Limits declaration, which was pretty startling. And of course, that was followed by, at the end of the month of February, the abrupt invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and not to mention North Korea going back to missile launches and so on. That was not a good start to the year, to say the least. On the other hand, last month was pretty interesting, pretty positive. The Biden administration held an ASEAN summit in Washington, which is very important and no mean feat. I know because I did it for Obama. This is only the second time that the ASEAN leaders came to the United States. They came to the Capitol. They were hosted. There was some good substance there. That was very positive. Then the inauguration in South Korea of President Yoon Suk-yeol. I'll tell you, whatever your opinion of Korea and the Koreans might be, there's been a huge improvement from the perspective of the West in the shift from Moon to Yoon. Biden had a constructive visit there and then came to Tokyo for a really positive bilateral series of meetings with Prime Minister Kishida. I think both in terms of establishing a personal relationship and also on the substantive agenda. That visit was a success. On top of that, Biden rolled out the much-awaited Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF. Now, admittedly, expectations were very, very low, justifiably so, but they managed to exceed expectations, certainly in terms of the participation. 13 countries, most of Southeast Asia, so that was pretty impressive. And most importantly, I think the Quad Summit, yep. and we can talk about that later. That was all followed by the visit to Washington by the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Ardern, and also you could say the failure of China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi to get Pacific Islands during his tour to sign up to the proclamation, the Security Pact, the regional deal that China had been pushing very, very, very hard. So there was definitely an uptick in the last month or so. But now when we look ahead to the balance of the year, there's more adventure, if not turmoil, in store. The The upper house elections in Japan don't seem to be a big cliffhanger. And if anything, may contribute markedly to the longevity and the stability and the success of the Kishida government. The U.S. midterms in early November, well, let's just say that the bookmakers are giving odds that the Republicans will take back the House, something in the order of 9-1, and that they will take the Senate. I think the odds are something around 7.5-1. So, you know, if you were betting, you would not bet on the Democrats. But elections are elections. And the midterms, frankly, are not going to really settle anything in U.S. politics. It will simply be the starter's gun for the race to 2024 and the White House, but it won't be pretty. That said, I think even if Biden emerges from the midterms looking weaker, and even if he's not able to get anything further done legislatively in Washington, that doesn't mean he can't be very effective in foreign policy and in how he engages in the Indo-Pacific region. On the Chinese side of the equation, of course, there's the 20th Chinese Communist Party Congress, where Xi Jinping is expected to be, I don't know, sainted, knighted, whatever, certainly given a third term, if not made president for life. He's already rewritten Chinese history to elevate himself on a par with Mao Zedong and a half a step higher than Deng Xiaoping. I haven't seen Ladbrokes give odds on the chances that Xi Jinping will get a third term, but my guess is if they did, it would be somewhere around 100%. He will be perceived as stronger after the party congress, but that does not mean that his troubles are going to diminish or that his actual power, which is already formidable, is going to increase. I mean, I think most analysts view, and I'm certainly one of the who warned early on that when you're in charge of everything, you run the risk of being responsible for everything. And not everything in China is going well. And we're seeing now how politics and ideology in Beijing keep undercutting the social and the economic reforms, the policies that China desperately needs really just to maintain a satisfactory growth trajectory and stability. So in the same month as these two political events, you've got the G20 in Jakarta, you've got the APEC leaders meeting in Bangkok. I think the big question for both of those meetings is whether in-person leaders' engagement will really happen. I mean, on the one hand, obviously, who knows what's next in Omicron. On the other hand is the issue of Vladimir Putin, who by rights should be invited to both of these events, but there's a lot of opposition to showing up at a party with the Wicked Witch of Moscow. So both of these meetings are emerging as a kind of major political test. And for me, the question hinges in part on whether there's a prospect for Xi Jinping and Biden to actually meet in person. Typically, the Chinese president, well, he would certainly go to the G20, and he would probably go to APEC. But these are not normal times. The video engagements between the two leaders have been pretty unsatisfactory, frankly, and I know from my own experience they do have a strong, genuine personal relationship that's undoubtedly been tested and perhaps weakened over the years, but it's one of the few positive things that the U.S. and China really have going. So were they to meet, the question is is it too late in the process, the U.S. China relationship, for an in-person meeting between Biden and Xi to reverse the downward spiral in the relationship? And I don't know. But if we take a step back, we can see that what's driving the turbulence has been a series of shocks. One obvious shock is COVID, and its continued impact on trade, on supply chains, on economic growth, and so on. One obvious shock is Putin's invasion of the Ukraine, as I mentioned. A third is shock emanating from the problems in the Chinese economy, which is looking increasingly challenged. And fourth shock I would list is the intensification of strategic rivalry between Washington and Beijing, or more accurately, between China and Russia on the one hand and the West on the other, the advanced economies and the predominantly democratic nations in Asia and Europe and in North America. So on the first point, you don't need me to rehearse the story of COVID, but I just flagged two things that strike me as important. One is that, remember that we're seeing the collapse of the Chinese Communist Party's narrative that they alone beat COVID, that their system was the one system in the world that could handle COVID without infection, without fatalities. Ironically, the Revolutionary Party, the CCP, was fighting the last war. They were fighting the war against COVID and maybe Delta. Omicron emerged as a sort of guerrilla war insurgency that has bedeviled them and created huge problems, not just medical problems, not just social problems, not just economic problems, but also political problems, problems for Xi Jinping, problems for the party. The second aspect of that I think is worth lifting up is that the development of the mRNA vaccine in the United States illustrated the continued power of American innovation, of American invention. And this has extraordinarily been something that Beijing simply, even after all this time, has been unable to replicate, despite the systematic looting of intellectual property of Western pharmaceutical companies through cyber theft. And despite calling back a battalion of Chinese American or Chinese national scientists who had been working on mRNA vaccines for Moderna and Pfizer, but who still back in China have not been to this day able to successfully produce and manufacture and distribute one. So those are clues, they're not verdicts. On Ukraine, we really don't know how this story is going to end. And the ending is going to matter for all of the world, for Asia. But I think the beginning matters arguably even more. Because this isn't a European issue, certainly not in the Asia-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific region can't unsee what we saw on February 24th. The flagrant violation of a key principle, a norm, a taboo against just using military force and invading a smaller neighbor because you want something they have. It's, smashing the plate glass window in Tiffany's and grabbing the jewelry. Saddam tried it in Kuwait. The world expelled him. Putin had taken small bites, Chechnya, of Crimea, but when he drove a tank right through the Ukraine border, drove a tank right through this taboo of violating the territorial sovereignty of a UN member state, Xi Jinping was in the passenger seat and went along for the ride. Xi Jinping was all in and subscribed without hesitation to the alibi that the devil made him do it, that Putin had no choice, it was all about NATO, pushed him into a corner and so on. Absolutely silent on the issue of sovereignty, territorial integrity, a lot of double talk about UN Charter and so on. But in one day, Putin transformed what had been a long-standing gray zone set of tactics, little green men, just short of military action. He transformed that kind of intimidation exercise into a black and white military action, a blitzkrieg that violated international law. And China's leader defended him to the hilt. That is what we all saw. So what country in the region couldn't instantly imagine the possibility that all of China's other gray zone activities in the air, in the sea, in the Senkakus, in the Spratlys, couldn't themselves suddenly go black and white? It stopped being a theoretical possibility. And I think that the invasion and the week or 2 weeks that followed it produced a profound shift in attitudes, certainly in publics and in governments throughout the Indo-Pacific, and a shift that's going to play out through 2022 and beyond. Third thing I mentioned is the Chinese economy, and I'm not an expert. There is an awful lot of fog surrounding the Chinese economy. There's a lot of questionable data. There's a lot of prejudice and bias that disposes people to be convinced that the Chinese economy is just a house of cards and a puff of wind will knock it down, or to be equally convinced that the Chinese economy is amazingly resilient and is going to, bury the West. Who knows? Half full, half empty, I don't know. But what I do know is that Chinese policymakers don't seem to know either. They keep stumbling, they keep experimenting, they keep backtracking, they keep procrastinating. The reforms that everybody, all of the well-educated Chinese financial and economic technocrats, many of whom I know, many of whom I deeply admire and respect, they know what to do. They know what needs to be done, but they can't do it. So today's China's economic prospects look significantly weaker than they did at the beginning of the year. The IMF has cut and keeps cutting its forecast for Chinese growth. You've got the crisis in the Chinese property sector, which is a huge component of GDP. Xi Jinping's political crackdown on the tech sector vaporized something on the order of $2 trillion in value. And these tech companies now in China are laying off thousands of people at a time when China desperately needs to create good employment for young white-collar workers. And of course, there's the effect of the zero COVID lockdowns. There's the rapidly aging and soon-to-be contracting population, the demographics. So let's just say that Xi Jinping, who has repeatedly and very explicitly framed economic performance as the clear proof of the superiority of the Chinese system, of this one-party autocracy, is facing a pretty steep uphill battle if he's going to outperform the quote-unquote declining West here. Lastly, the fourth factor I see as really destabilizing in the region, and this is not new, and I think I talked about this a year ago, is the intensifying strategic rivalry between China and the United States, and as I said earlier, between China and the West. It's a giant topic. I don't want to drone on, but it's certain what seemed like a possibility last year now to me feels like a reality, that we are deeply mired in a zero-sum security dilemma in which every move that one side takes is seen as aggressive by the other. And every move that each side takes to defend against that perceived aggression is prompting an escalatory response from the other. So, you know, each movement validates and serves as a rationale for the next, and nobody seems to know how to reverse that. China's capabilities have grown. China's national pride has grown. China's ambition has grown. China is seeking to reshape the global order, global governance in ways that are more favorable, more suitable to China, more advantageous to China. That's not a crime. It's perfectly understandable. But it is one of the factors that's driving this security dilemma, particularly since so much of the behavior that China exhibits threatens the U.S., threatens Japan, threatens Australia, India, Europe, and others, and they're responding to it. And we see in the response the revitalization of the Quad. We see the strengthening of alliance cooperation. China, in turn, sees instead an emerging containment bloc, the Asian NATO, that's out to get them. And China, as I said, is defending Putin while claiming a kind of pseudo-neutrality, while at the same time launching an effort to build a security relationship with Pacific Islands, with others. I'm not going to keep going, but I think the dynamic here is clear, and it is an escalatory dynamic with no obvious circuit breaker ready. So I'm sure there's interest in and questions about things like the Quad, about the Indo-Pacific economic framework, about North Korea, about Japan-Korea and trilateral relations. These are important topics. Leave it to you, Jesper. I'll just end on this note. Japan has elected, and the upper house vote is likely, or expected at least, to cement a strong and stable government under Fumio Kishida, who is very well known and well regarded in Washington. I think most people believe that he has all of the pro-alliance activist instincts of Abe Shinzo, but none of the perceived right-wing baggage. And so that's a net plus. We have already seen Japan take really formidable and valuable initiative on things like the Quad, on regional diplomacy, on economic and infrastructure investment, standing up in response to the invasion of the Ukraine, on Pacific Island issues, on Taiwan policy. So I'm a broken record on this topic, but from my point of view, Japan is America's most valuable strategic partner, strategic asset, if I could say, but also America's most undervalued partner. It is easy for Americans to take Japan for granted, but the high quality and the reliability of this bilateral relationship is a particularly valuable asset in turbulent times such as 2022. So let me stop there. That was a lot, and
God, yes, that was a lot, and we're only just scratching on the surface, but the depth of your insight, and particularly the fact that you know these people. You know the people, who do keep the doors open, in the People's Republic of China. You do know the people, who want to engage around the world, and it's always fascinating to have just an insight from that perspective that goes beyond all the hype, that everybody talks about. So we've got Japan as a bastion of stability, which is always good. talk a little bit about Korea. Because Korea was always the more volatile element, both vis-a-vis the United States of America as well as vis-a-vis Japan. There's been an important change in Korea. How do you read Korea, and what's on your wish list for what Japan could do to actually take things further?
Mm-hmm. Well, the international situation, the regional situation in the Indo-Pacific that Japan faces, Korea faces, and the United States face, with the mix of global threats and of specific regional threats, first and foremost North Korea, but close second, problematic Chinese behavior, means that no one of the three countries has the luxury of doing anything less than cooperating fully on a bilateral and a trilateral basis. This is a moment of crisis. And to allow bilateral problems, inherited problems, historical problems, other problems, to impede the full functioning of our strategic and defense and our economic collaboration is suicidal. Now, that may all be true, and it may be easy to say, but it doesn't trump politics, and it doesn't trump social attitudes. The huge difference here is the departure of the Moon Jae-in government, which, in my view, gratuitously violated solemn agreement reached between the two, if not the three countries, on the historical and comfort women issues, and instead reopened and ultimately escalated tensions between Seoul and Tokyo, particularly with respect to the issue of forced labor, seizure of assets, the risk of liquidation of those assets, and so on. So the problems have been compounded, not ameliorated. The Yoon government, which won by well under 1% of the vote, and I have to say, to the immense credit of Korea and the Korean democracy, the opponent instantly and graciously conceded. A model I hope my country will follow in the future. The Yoon government came in with people who, to your early point, I happen to know very, very well because they had important positions in diplomacy in the Park Geun-hye era, and are many of the same people that helped to engineer the original 2015 Japan-Korea deal. They came in overtly committed to finding a way to improve bilateral relations and to ensure trilateral cooperation. We're looking down the barrel of a North Korean nuclear test. That is eminently likely. We just had a barrage of missile tests from North Korea in the last 24 hours. You don't need a Ouija board to read this future. And so the sooner the impediments to trilateral and bilateral full military cooperation can be removed, the better. It's not easy. How? Well, the Japanese Vice Foreign Minister, Mori Takeo, is in Seoul today. So is my former colleague, Wendy Sherman, Deputy Secretary for Trilateral Talks. I think this marks, well, I should say that the visit to Seoul for the Yoon inauguration by Foreign Minister Hayashi marked the beginning of the exploratory phase, followed, of course, by Yoon's visit to Tokyo for the Quad follow-up and the IPEF launch. But I think now we're really getting into the exploration of what will this look like, what would it take, who does what. Yeah. And look, there are virtuous circles where every action by the other side makes it easier for you to compromise, and there are vicious cycles where the opposite happens. So getting started, getting that kind of clockwise positive motion is critically important. I think that for Japan, this is going to be a moment to exercise some Christian forbearance, shall we say. I think the Japanese policymakers can be forgiven for feeling like they've gone through the classic Lucy and the football era, where they think they've made a deal and taken a run at bilateral relations only to have it snatched away. The Koreans, for their part, have a long litany of grievances and complaints and so on. None of this is going to be easy, but there is now, I think, in place the raw material for rebuilding a modicum of trust, which is easy to destroy and very difficult to rebuild. The stars have never been better aligned than they are today for improvement in bilateral Japan-Korea relations and for restoration and expansion of real trilateral cooperation. And you just look through your telescope north to Russia, northwest to China, all around the world, and you'll see that we, as I've said, can't afford anything less.
It is interesting because I think, over the last decade in particular, Japan has really emerged as a very responsible leader in multilateral agreements, right? I mean, keeping, whether it's the TPP, promoting the Quad. On the multilateral side, Japan has been the rational, pragmatic, sensible adult in the room and also leader. And in my personal opinion, if they can actually get the bilateral with Korea correct, then they do deserve a seat at the National Security Council. Not the national one, the UN Security Council. Maybe they deserve a seat at the U.S. National Security Council. No, want to pivot, from Korea, and I'm sure that there will be other questions, from the audience. Want to pivot to one other country that you didn't talk a lot about, which is India. India obviously is there as a key member of the Quad, but India also is a little bit torn vis-a-vis the Ukraine and vis-a-vis Russia. What's your read on India? How should we be thinking about that?
Well, China has no one to blame for India's activism in the Quad but itself. I think it's no more complicated than it appears. In the aftermath of the Galwan violence, given Chinese behavior, India basically decided to jettison decades of strict and proud, non-aligned status, and, albeit with caveats and in its own way, have come to align quite closely with Japan, with the United States, with Australia. A tremendous amount of credit also goes to former Prime Minister Abe and the Japanese government for really reaching out and wooing Modi and India. Certainly understanding and engaging with them, that's helped. But I think the lion's share of the credit goes to China. The Quad, I think, has been amazingly productive, very successful, and one of the reasons is that the Quad the Quad drivers, the U.S., Japan, and Australia, have made a virtue of necessity. There just politically is not a willingness on India's part to be quite as forward-leaning, quite as declarative on a number of issues, including overtly on China, on Taiwan, certainly on Russia, as the other three are. So instead of turning the Quad into a kind of battering ram juggernaut, kind of a militaristic security sort of grouping. It has instead reinvented itself as the principal provider of public goods to the region through its vaccine initiative, through its education and training initiative, through its emerging technology initiative, through its climate resilience initiative that directly assists countries in Southeast Asia, directly assists countries in South Asia. So here are 4 countries banding together in a way that makes the whole greater than the sum of the parts. And India is all in that part of the equation, and I think it's been tremendously valuable and productive. But when it comes to the Ukraine, India faces a dilemma. And it is precisely the same dilemma that Vietnam faces. India and Vietnam feel threatened by China. They consider China to be their principal threat. Their military posture is oriented around defense against China. Their military posture is comprised of weapons from Russia. And not just weapons, but ammunition, spare parts, you name it. There's no pathway to switch. This is not Apple iPhone to Galaxy kind of operation. For either India or Vietnam, for that matter, to wean itself off of relatively inexpensive Russian weaponry that it has been purchasing for decades, that its entire defense system is trained on, is structured around. I don't have a great analogy, but it's a lot harder than switching from gas-powered to electric vehicles. It's going to take a long time, and it's going to be insanely expensive. So for a country like India to avoid gratuitous public commentary that increase the risk that Russia is going to play games, turn off the spigot, impede India's ability to sustain its own defense against its primary challenge, that's very understandable. And I don't consider it to be an incompatibility within the Quad or within the grouping, because it doesn't inhibit India from actively participating. I know from talking to folks in Washington, in Canberra, and in Tokyo yesterday that the conversations, the content, the substance of the discussions among the leaders was extremely candid, extremely valuable, extremely productive. That matters a lot more than whether you get some rote formula about Russian aggression in a joint statement. So I think that we, which is to say U.S., Australia, Japan, others, can work around India's idiosyncratic paradox when it comes to Russia and the Ukraine. We certainly understand it and can embark on a longer-term project, not limited to India, but that includes, as I said, countries such as Vietnam, to help them find ways to diversify their military procurement systems.
No, with the Quad, and with the relationship with India, what is, as an outsider, what was very interesting to see is just the depth and the breadth and the speed with which the Quad has developed. Because literally, I think 3 years ago, it wasn't really there, right? And now, the depth and the breadth really seems to be very, very strong. Now, it's your session, so I do want to open it up. Kenji. If you could very quickly just give a little bit of an introduction, just who you are.
Okay, Kenji, nice to meet you, Danny, again. Founding member of Asia Society, Tokyo Center, and with Bain & Company in Tokyo. I got two provocative questions, Danny, if you allow me. So the first one is, if I'm Putin, obviously I'm not, why would I wait for President Biden to be elected to invade Ukraine? It would be much better for him to do it while Trump was president, actually, because it would have been very difficult for Trump to obviously organize a coalition around him. So I know it's a bit of a war scenario, so I'm not necessarily expecting a straight answer on this one, but I'm a little bit, I was being extremely surprised by the level of success that the Biden administration has displayed in basically federating all the winning powers in Europe in particular, and in Germany and many others, Sweden more recently. So, is there any reason to believe that actually there was objective reasons for Putin not to invade Ukraine when Trump was president? Because it would have been probably a better case for him, actually, because, so that was my question number one. Question number two is quite different. It's about actually the strengths of the U.S. Japan alliance, which, something that I've become aware recently with all the talks that we're having. So my kind of a provocative question here is do you feel that China feels threatened by that strength, actually? So if I'm a Chinese, on the Chinese side, I see the largest economy in the world being very, very close to the third largest economy of the world. Obviously, one of them is not a nuclear power. But, we talk about China, Russia, that's the second largest economy of the world with the 11th largest economy of the world. So from an economic perspective, actually, the strength is here, not there. So do you feel actually there's a feeling which is about being threatened that guides the Chinese policy?
Great. I generally don't know the answer to the first question. I don't know what Putin's calculus was or is, other than he clearly thought that it should be possible to unseat Zelensky, the government in Kyiv, replace it with a supportive puppet kind of regime, claim or reclaim territories in the east that are primarily Russian-speaking, and that he would present the world with fait accompli that it couldn't really do anything about, and that would convince NATO that it needed to back off and be more attentive to his demands. That didn't work, but the timing, I don't understand. I haven't really researched it. I'm not a Russia scholar, but
the Germans all think it was after Angela Merkel left.
That's as good an answer as any. What Putin might have, there's certainly a wide-held view in the United States that if Putin had moved on to Ukraine during the Trump administration, there would be a Trump Tower hotel under construction right now in Donetsk that he would have gotten a free pass. So maybe he missed his moment. I generally don't know. On the second very important question, there are two answers to the question: how does China feel threatened by the U.S. Japan alliance? The first answer is yes, and the second answer is yes, but. Yes, because the Chinese don't do alliances. It is all about China. Everything is all about China. China, after all, is the Chunuk, the center. And there are convenient other actors, neighbors, tributary states, vassal states, whatever, but not real partners, not real allies. No one can ever become Chinese, right? You either are or you're not. Socialism with Chinese characteristics. Everything is China-centric. And so I think just the notion of a partnership of equals is not something that can be rendered into the Chinese political psyche. And therefore, the perception of the U.S. China, the perception of the U.S. Japan alliance or the broader alliance networks is a perception of something that's inherently alien. It's different. Moreover, as you point out, a network of alliances is a geometric force multiplier in economic and trade, in science and technology, and certainly in defense and military operations. The interoperability and the interconnectivity of the U.S. military and Japan, the strategic coordination at those levels, dramatically magnify America's national power, strategic power, or Japan's. And Chinese planners have got to reckon always with the prospect that in some conflict or confrontation with the United States, they're also going to be dealing with Japan, which has a very formidable military capability and is right here. They also have to reckon with the prospect of other allies and partners, Australia, South Korea, etc. So yes, the alliance is intimidating. I think the yes, but part of the equation is that the Chinese Communist Party is a vanguard revolutionary Leninist party. And I use all the jargon for a reason, because they do, and they believe it. And at the core of that vanguard revolutionary party is Marxist-Leninism, and Leninism specifically. And a key feature of Leninism, as I have come to know it, is paranoia. The conviction that everybody else is out to get you. When Biden as vice president first met with Xi Jinping, they had some formal meetings in China in 2011, but then went to Chengdu for a two-day kind of retreat, and they had lots of meals and walks and time to talk, and one of the very intimate dinners they had allowed for a pretty open conversation between the two vice presidents. And I vividly remember Xi Jinping describing the challenges that China faces internally, regionally, externally, structurally. And the picture that he painted of China is of a very vulnerable state whose natural condition is a kind of entropy, where different regional and ethnic and political factions are constantly pulling it apart. He described that as in an effort to explain why China needs a single party, not a multi-party democracy, why that party needs a strong leadership, a strong hand, etc. Because without that strong hand and one party, China would pull itself apart. He also described China as being in a very treacherous, very difficult neighborhood. Sound familiar? With 14, I don't know, I forget, land borders, 7 maritime borders, maybe it's the other way around. Lots of vexing, problematic neighbors. And certainly, as a Leninist, he seemed to believe a malevolent, external set of actors who were out to contain China, for whom the century of humiliation was, like summer vacation. It was just the way we wanted it. And who were constantly trying to divide China, subvert it, undermine it, and so on. So the yes, but is that part of the fear and loathing that China exhibits towards the U.S.-Japan alliance is pathological. just as part of it is logical.
Thank you. It's wonderful to see you here in Tokyo, Danny. And Jesper, you asked, I thought, a very interesting question that, really I would like to pursue. You said Japan is a responsible leader on multilateral matters. And I agree totally with CPTPP and a range of other matters, certainly, and the Quad. But one that no one's touched on so far, which is important because Japan is going to be chairing next year, is, of course, G7. And now with the Ukraine crisis, that has much more immediacy than it did previously. I wonder if you have anything to say about Japan and also possibly Korea in the context of G7.
Well, yes, I think it is certainly fortuitous from the point of view of the United States that Japan will again host the G7. I came for the last one in Ise. And there's undoubtedly a lot of work. We saw, frankly, this year in the Japanese chairmanship of the Quad, which is a sort of a loose chairmanship, but it means driving an agenda and corralling countries and issues. I think a new-found talent for that kind of multilateral international leadership. It's not heavy-handed, but it's been quite effective. The Ise G7 summit, I don't have a great memory, but I do remember that it produced some really important initiatives. One that I keep coming back to is the sort of clean infrastructure or the infrastructure standards. I mean, these are like foundational agreements that have set the standard for other groups, for industry, et cetera. So these are not like ephemeral or trivial outcomes, and I would expect that from the Japanese stewardship of the G7, we're going to get a lot more than just G7 declarations. We're going to get initiatives, we're going to get agreements. It's going to have an aim and a purpose and a strategy for achieving those aims. It is equally fortuitous that in the same year, the United States is hosting APEC. And even though economy may not be the strongest point of the Biden administration thus far, and nevertheless, and APEC is going to represent a challenge, as it always does, as a consensus organization, maybe more so than ever. But in any event, Japan and the United States will have important roles, and I'm confident coordinated roles in two of these important multilateral institutions. I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm being a big Japan booster because I'm in Japan or because I have a history with Japan, but I'll honestly say that I'm very impressed. When I first served in Tokyo in 1985, which now sounds like a long time ago, and subsequently in 1989 went to the UN and worked with the Japanese mission and UN on these issues. I dealt with a radically different country. And what I think that we are seeing now is what you could call middle power wisdom. There's a good mix of ambition and humility. And the heavy reliance and respect for multilateralism is a function of not being such a gargantuan superpower that you don't need to ask anybody what they think. Right? The United States, I hope I'm not making news here, has diminished as a superpower in relative terms. And let's face it, that's on purpose. That was the initial intent of the Bretton Woods, of the San Francisco Treaty, of the post-war strategy, that we wanted to not be the only mansion in a demolished neighborhood. We wanted to build up Europe. We wanted to build up East Asia. We wanted a thriving economy, lift all boats kind of thing. And we got it. And so, all right, America's share of the greater pie is diminished. Now, I'm not saying it's all gone precisely according to plan, but given the diminished relative power and strength of the United States, not to mention a 4-year experiment in psychotic isolationism, the emergence of Japan as a strategic, wise, active middle power is immensely valuable and timely.
It's interesting, that Japan is the wise middle power that gets things done in the world. I mean, a little known fact: for 7 years running, Japan is the single largest lender provider of cross-border credit. So American banks have actually withdrawn, globally. European banks have withdrawn globally. Everybody thinks China is bankrolling the emerging world. No, it's not. China is doing Belt and Road, very pinpoint strategy, but the breadth and depth of cross-border finance, Japan is actually on top of the world. Not just a one-off, but actually a consistent strategy that you have from all of Japan's financial institutions. So you've got the economics and finance sort of backing up the political leadership, that the Abe administration, let's just call it the LDP, basically pursues. Now, want to broaden it out a little bit? Sawako, I think we've got a couple of questions from cyberspace.
Yes, we do. And that actually, what you just mentioned about Belt and Road is just the question that we have. Danny, you and Blake had worked on 2 Belt and Road reports. Is there a third one coming? And also, can you elaborate on, the ASPI's Asia Society Policy Institute's initiatives going forward now that it's growing quite a bit?
Yep. Wow. I think I owe somebody money for that question. It's a great one. Sounds like a setup. So we've actually done 3 big projects already on Belt and Road in 2 different programs. One of them is on the digital Silk Road. It's called Stacking the Deck. It came out last year, and it focuses on the really powerful way that China has begun to influence and shape digital technical standards, both through active, overwhelming participation in technical standard-setting organizations, ISSO and so on, but also in a more commercial, some would say insidious way, by facts on the ground, by embedding in Belt and Road projects digital Silk Road technological units, components basically, smart city, safe cities, smart ports, data centers, fiber optics, digital urban control centers, not to mention Huawei, 5G network backbones, and so on. And just the way, frankly, in a previous generation, maybe Motorola or Apple tended to lock in path dependencies using their products so that, some people will remember Beta VHS. Chinese companies, including in things like electronic payments and so on, are kind of seizing territory and establishing themselves as the norm. And we wrote that report really to just put some facts out in the open and raise people's consciousness so that we don't all wake up one day and discover that the world is all Huawei or something like that. The work that we've done most recently that is going to be unveiled at the end of July is, I think, very creative and certainly unprecedented. We created a digital microsite that is first and foremost on a smartphone but also has a desktop version that is meant to be used by the stakeholders in developing countries where big Belt and Road projects are either being planned or are underway. And this is a toolkit. So in Laos, in the Lao language, or in Cambodia, in Khmer, in Sri Lanka, in Sinhasa, in Indonesia, in Bahasa, you get an easy to read, very intuitive website that walks you through step-by-step checklists. What do I do if? What does it mean when a Chinese developer is announcing a project? I want to know about labor. I want to know about how you would be able to see a environmental impact assessment. I want to know what my options are if I have a complaint or a grievance, or even just who makes what decision and how to contact them. So it walks you through checklists step by step. Is it a project being planned? Is it a project underway? Are you looking to find out who's involved? Do you want to know what are the rules that Chinese contractors have to operate under by Chinese law and regulations? Do you want to know how a Chinese developer is organized and how you would reach any given company? Do you want to know what your rights are? Do you want to see a template of a letter addressing an issue or requesting more information? Which target would you send it to? A local official in your own government, or to a Chinese embassy, or to the Chinese developer? What are the international standards here? And what international organization or NGO could I contact to ask for help or to ask for more information? Our intended users, audiences, are a wide range of what we call stakeholders. So it could be a local civil society organization, it could be a village headman or a religious leader, it could be a landowner who's being displaced by a dam or who suffered some damage. It could be a local businessman in Laos who wants to know why won't they buy my lumber? Why won't they use my labor to build this thing? It could be a local official who doesn't really know what to do with this influx of Chinese officials and laborers and so on. So, not to belabor it, but having been a government policy practitioner, I don't really have a huge affection for these big reports with glossy covers that you put up on your bookshelf. I never read them when I was in government making decisions.
They're good for stopping doors.
That's right. And they're also good for Zoom backgrounds. What I care about is having an impact, being practical. And so we're very proud of this toolkit concept. And we're hoping to be able, once it's launched and goes live, we're hoping to be refunded to expand it, to put it in more languages and maybe make it available to users in other areas that host Belt and Road projects, whether it's Africa or Central Asia or elsewhere.
Thank you very much. I have a question. What do you think should be Japan's plan B if we as Americans repeat the 4-year experiment, but it becomes an 8-year experiment or 12-year experiment, which is not impossible? I mean, if you look at American political history in the past few years. So what is Japan's plan B if by 2030 we are essentially Trumpland?
Well, I mean, one option is sort of the 16th century sakoku, just, limit foreigners to one port in Nagasaki. Look, I mean, I think that by and large, the Abe government successfully navigated those very choppy waters by holding their nose and making some compromises and sticking close to Trump, sticking close to the United States, turning the other cheek when Japan got hit egregiously with national security sanctions and other things like that. Admittedly, that will be hard to replicate. I am of the view that that experience and some other factors have contributed to a growing sense in Japan that Japan needs to acquire more strategic autonomy. It's not that I think there are policymakers in Tokyo who believe that Japan doesn't need the United States or that there's a better alternative to a close economic, political, and security partnership with the United States. But those 4 years did, jar loose some doubts about American reliability and credibility and sustainability. And certainly if there was a repeat of that, let alone for 2 terms instead of 1, I think more and more confidence in the U.S. would be frayed, and Japan would likely look to take on more autonomy, enhance its ability to make autonomous choices, number 1. So maybe detach, distance, protect itself a little bit from the United States. And some of that would be likely the United States detaching more from Japan, as we saw in those 4 years. And secondly, I think we would expect more of a middle power condominium. In other words, we already began to see active outreach by Tokyo to Australia, active outreach to India, very active outreach to Europe as the EU and to specific European countries, and to the UK in particular. If, as I think we all hope, there is a significant improvement in bilateral ties with Korea, and if, as I certainly hope, the trend of Korea be broadening its aperture to focus not exclusively on the Korean Peninsula, but more broadly on the region, etc. And if Taiwan can endure as an autonomous democratic economy, I would expect that the trend would be that those peers would be increasingly important partners for Japan, and there would be a greater trend towards collective action among them. But it's not a future I'd like to see.
Thank you. I think none of us wants to.
Danny, I'm going to exercise my right here. That's asking the last question, and you mentioned it in your previous answer towards the end. How do you think about Taiwan?
I think of Taiwan as a immensely attractive democratic society that is technologically and economically productive, that has shown courage and resilience in areas like pandemic response, like cyber, but that is a victim of a very peculiar twist in history. And in New England, there's a famous joke about a visitor stopping and asking a local farmer for directions. How do I get to Burlington or wherever? And the farmer stops and thinks and says, "You can't get there from here." I think that a main joke, right? I think that the same conundrum applies with Taiwan's the future prospects of Taiwan's statehood, and that this is a case where the least worst possible outcome is maintaining the status quo. And the status quo is essentially the fiction that Taiwan is either a part of China or China is a part of Taiwan. And we're not going to split hairs over which is which. And we, the West, can deal with and trade with and travel to Taiwan in most respects, but always stop short of assigning anything that is an attribute of statehood. So we're not dealing with the Republic of China. And certainly during the Ma Ying-jeou, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao years, and certainly the Obama first term, when cross-strait ties between the mainland and Taiwan were growing positively, the status quo felt pretty good. A little bit like Deng Xiaoping said about the senkakus, like, this is not a problem that we can solve. We need to shelve it in hopes that someday there'll be a future generation that's wiser than us. Well, that generation hasn't made its appearance yet, either for the senkakus or for Taiwan. That said, the security dilemma that I described is playing out on the battlefield of Taiwan. And every move that one side makes to deter or discourage or push back the other in the name of preserving the status quo has the opposite effect. The Chinese are correct in saying that the kind of founding document held that the U.S. wasn't taking issue with, wasn't agreeing, but wasn't taking issue with Beijing's claim that Taiwan is a part of China, number one. And number two, that the U.S. committed to not recognizing both China and Taiwan, which in today's world would certainly seem to be the sensible way to go, and would not support Taiwan independence. Taiwan is already very autonomous, and it's that autonomy that I think people in the West, and certainly people in Taiwan, want to preserve. But you can't get there from here. And so I think that the best that we can hope for, and what we actually really need to work towards, is protecting the status quo, even though that status quo is essentially a fiction. And part of the fiction is that someday Taiwan may peacefully unify with the mainland. We shouldn't object to that. We should keep that hope alive in Beijing, because if that flame goes out, then we know what plan B is, because they're not giving up. But it feels increasingly far-fetched, and ironically and tragically, the more that the mainland does to try to hold on to that prospect of unification, the more they are driving, particularly the younger generation, to the conviction that they have a separate identity as Taiwanese. They don't consider themselves to be part of the, subject to the Yellow Emperor, part of the great Chinese diaspora. And the strains and the risks continue to grow.
Danny, thank you very, very much. This was absolutely fascinating.